Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Community Camera. We're coming to you from the Spencer Hill campus of Corning Community College, where the Learning Resources Center is located. And here we are today with our visiting scholar this week, the last day of her visit, Nikki Giovanni, poet. Welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you.
That's a short introduction. But,
sufficient.
We're really delighted. I like to do this program at the end of a visit, as I'm doing today.
And everybody yawns on you, as I'm doing.
Well, you're tired, yes, yes, you're tired, but I'm better informed, you see. Well. So that makes me able, hopefully, during the course of a half hour, to ask one or two intelligent questions out of the larger number.
No problem. They've all been intelligent.
I think that people looking in and hearing a poet being interviewed want to know a little bit about the career of being a poet. At some point in your life, you must have decided this was something you wanted to do, and it's something that people do perhaps for a little while, and then they kind of cast it off as, why did you want to be a poet rather than a novelist? Or
well, I can't write novels, so that was real easy. And I don't think novelistically. I don't think like a playwright thinks. I think, you know, these are special ways of looking at the world. You know, novels are always building up these great systems, and you know, people are born and die, and you know, they go on for generations. I don't even read that many novels. I really like the work of Toni Morrison or Gloria Naylor, but if you think about, I mean, when I think about it, most of my reading is nonfiction. So I'm not a novelistic thinker. I think poetry is a good profession. I like it a lot. It's comfortable. I do think poetically, and I think the essence of poetry is that we kind of cut to the heart of it.
Okay, and
we can be accused of simplifying. I don't think we necessarily simplify, but we do go to the heart of it. I think probably any poet is a good analysis of people.
So really, it's a different thing, writing poetry. Sure. It's different in each word has to carry a greater burden of both meaning and emotion in the poem, doesn't it? A poem is so concise.
Well, it should. I mean, it doesn't necessarily just have to. What you would like to do is to juxtapose your words so that if they're carrying meaning, then the combination creates the emotion, you know, and just in terms of how you're creating it. But I really, I mean, we've talked a lot about writing up here. I tend to be a little laid back, so I think that people make too much out of poetry. 90% of poetry should be enjoyed, and I don't think we teach it that way, and I don't think we allow people to enjoy it. I was kind of teasing the kids this afternoon on the symposium, why don't we study Robert Frost? Because he's not analyzable. Because when you read Walking Through the Woods on a Snowy Day, that's it. You know, there's nothing else to say about it. What did the poet mean? That's what he meant.
Do you like Frost?
Sure, I like Frost because Frost is understandable. What does it mean, good neighbors? Good fences make good neighbors. That's not really difficult. And if we were doing an essay on it, we'd have to do an essay from personal experience, which eliminates the right and wrong of it. Because what we're saying is, are you properly relating? That's all we can really ask. Yeah, I like Frost, but you know, the American poetry establishment was certainly happy the day he died, because he was much too clear and he was much too accessible, you know. And I think writing should be clear and accessible. I would hope that my writing is accessible.
If you're too clear and too accessible, a lot of critics and analysts can't make a living analyzing it.
Well, you don't really make a living doing criticism of poetry anyway, so I think there's a lot of ego there. I think American arts and letters suffers from a certain level of critical input, you know, really. I think I put the critics right up there with the journalists. You know, they're not a bright group, and when you think about it, they produce very little that's worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. Before we get into some of the areas you're interested in, I want to just explore a little more about the point at which you felt you were no longer writing poems just for yourself, but that you had an audience and that you were able to publish. You were talking about that today at the Reaction Symposium. I'd like the viewers to just hear a little more of that. How did you break in? How did you break that barrier of getting published and getting an audience and being a poet that people read?
I'm probably just really lucky on that. But I think, first of all, any book deserves its own audience. I don't think that's the question. The question is finding your audience, you know. And I was teasing the kids sort of, because if you sit here in Elmira, you probably are not going to reach your maximum audience. You're going to have to go someplace where people are doing it. I think it's important for poets to read and for poets to make their work accessible, no matter what level of poetry we're writing. In my own case, I published my first book in 1967. I formed a small publishing company, and again, we had a monetary situation that would allow that to happen. Oil, I was teasing the kids, but it's true, oil is directly related to books, and the price of oil will determine what the price of books will be. As it is now dropping, though some people are complaining, it's very good for the book industry because we'll get a lot more young writers there. We'll get a lot more marginal writers in there, or marginal books. I suppose there are no marginal
in books, as
writers.
far as you get more mileage for the dollar.
And that would be good. We'll be able to actually, which we would want to do, and I think the profession wants to do, we'll be able to reduce the price of books, because the average book is $15, which is just too high. And it's hard on libraries, too.
It's hard on libraries, it's hard on the reader, but it's especially hard on the young
unknown
artist
writer
trying to break in.
Well, you almost can't break in, because who's going to pay $15 for a book they never heard of? And even if you get reviewed, it's just very difficult.
I was interested to hear you talking about the way you really had to put your neck on the block and get some people to support you, to get some money up front, to get a book published, to get started.
Well, the block came because of the, just so we can stay clear on what put my neck on the block, because I rented Lincoln Center for my 30th birthday party. At that point, I had already had a career, so it was not, it was a risk, but not overwhelming by any means. I was lucky that I sold out, but I wasn't lucky that I sold out. I worked hard to sell it out, because a 60% house would have been a break-even point. But for a black woman to produce a show in Lincoln Center, which had never been done before that particular event, you would need to be sold out, which we were. I think that you take a lot of risk, is what I was saying to the kids. You take a lot of risk. To some degree, it's calculated, because you figure you're not really going to lose. You know, I mean, I really didn't think that I would have to pay off Lincoln Center. I would not have done that if I didn't think I had something like a 99% chance of, in fact, selling it out. I had already sold out Alice Tully Hall, which is the rehearsal hall there. It's 1,500 seats. I figured if I could sell out 1,500 seats without working, I could sell out 35 with a little effort. And Lincoln Center had a very good director at that point, Patrick McGinnis. And McGinnis decided to take a chance. I would have owed him $5,000 if I hadn't done it, but we really felt that it could be done. I learned a lot about producing, and I think it's worthwhile. I'm saying this to say, because I don't want to confuse somebody. I would not, if I were publishing my first book, go down and rent Lincoln Center, because you got to lose on those conditions. You have to have a relationship with your audience, and you have to know whether or not you can count on them. I've had very good sales over the last 18 years, and all of my books are still in print. And I think a part of that is that I still care very, very much about whether or not people are reading me and whether or not people are, in fact, buying the books. And you try to get around with that. You can't overstate it. I think that all writers write for themselves. I would always say that. I always believe that. I don't think you can say I have an audience and I have to write for them. A lot of my audience gets upset with me because they started with me in 1967, and I'm not the same person or the same poet that I was. On the other hand, I have new people. So you try to balance it out, because if you let your audience control you, you'll never grow.
How have you changed over this time period, either in substance or style of your poetry? What do you feel are your major changes in your development?
I certainly hope. I don't know. I don't try to answer those questions. I would simply say I do hope that there has been a change in both substance and style. I know we can see it in a book like Those Who Ride the Night Winds, because I went to the ellipse and I went to a full page, because I think sometimes it just gets to be boring, that you're looking at poetry and it's all running up and down and up and down, and the reader can ask themselves, why is that happening? I know as a writer I ask myself, why am I wasting 2/3 of this page? It's because somebody in Occ 12 wrote like that, and I wanted to just simply change the way that I looked at it. I wanted to utilize my full page, and I wanted to do something different with the eye of the reader. It was a comfortable write. I enjoyed writing Night Winds. I like the, thematically it's about a lot of individuals who I think are significant people. It's not the significant people of the world. It's not a profiles in courage. It's just a book about people that I enjoyed. But I think you're always going to want to make some changes, because I know how to do a vertical line. I know how to balance it out. And it would just get to be tiresome to keep doing that same thing, you know, when I say over and over and over again. You want to do something different. Thematically, of course, we did a lot with thoughts, with ideology, with philosophy. I don't think I have anything to add to that, and I don't have any great changes to make, so it's time to go on to something else. And so we went to individuals. People have always fascinated me, and that's from my first book in '67 to Night Winds. I'm ever fascinated by both our genius and our stupidity. You know, people are a trip. They're not a bright group. I mean, if you think about us as a species, we're not really that bright a group, and basically we're not that kind. But you kind of see the potential And you think, okay, I can either complain about the fact that we're stupid and mean, or I can tap into the potential that we can be better. I happen to think we can be better, so I look at it that way.
I'm glad our students, as well as the faculty and everyone else, had a chance to hear you, but especially the students. It seemed to me these 3 days that if we have a student or a few students that are interested in creative writing in general, poetry in particular, that you would be an especially good person for them to hear. And the reason I say that is I don't know when I've heard anyone talk about the subject of writing poetry where the barriers seem to fall more completely and where you seem to make it more accessible. And I can't quite put my finger on it.
It's an accessible profession. I would welcome anyone to it. I think one of the things that happens in art, really, is that everybody thinks that what they're supposed to do is go out and beat the other guy. You know, we're not a sport. This is not a contest where somebody's going to get more points than the other. It's not that way. We are a competitive profession. Certainly poetry is one of our highly competitive professions. And if you're into gossip, you know that one of the things they didn't like about Frost is that he was so ambitious. But the only difference between Frost's ambition and, say, W.H. Auden is that Frost was up front with it. He says, I want to be the best poet. I want to go out and I want to overwhelm you with my poetry. Auden would sit back and be doing the same thing in his own little vicious way. I didn't care for Mr. Auden, as you may have gathered. I had the displeasure of having met him. And I just think that at some point, it's important to tell youngsters, yes, we're all out here. Hopefully, anybody that gets lucky, you get caught in a golden age. You get caught with one brilliant writer. And one brilliant writer makes all the difference in the world because all writing elevates. It's good for everybody. And the point there is not to tear that person down, but to say, yes, okay, there is a new standard. And you look for that. And I'm saying it's competitive in that you would like to know, if that's the standard, I want to write better than that. I want to practice a little harder. I want to make it a little bit better. But that's not the same as I can't be a good poet because Giovanni is there or because somebody else is there. My job is to be encouraging.
Instead of inhibiting.
It is. I mean, my job is to say, hey, it's wide open, and it is. I mean, I really believe that. If there are 200 million Americans and there are, I don't know how many practicing poets, maybe 1/10 of 1% of the whole damn population,
something like that.
It's wide open. And any other poet that comes along will only make it better for the rest of us. My career should make it better for young poets. The young poets that come along, we should keep opening it up.
It really isn't competitive, is it? The
it's
more
competitive because you want to be the best.
But the more people that you get to read good poetry,
it's not. You don't eliminate. This is not the NCAA. You don't.
No elimination.
No eliminations. What you're doing is adding in. I mean, if I was going to be a sculptor, I would have loved to have been around in Michelangelo's days. Why would you want to sculpt at a point when nobody's sculpting? You know, you'd want to be there when David was created, and you'd say, new standard. Or, you know, you'd want to be there when Da Vinci, I mean, goodness, who wouldn't want to live in Da Vinci's time? You'd want to be there with that level of genius because then you know there are no limits.
So you're talking about the light they give off rather than the shadow that they...
I'm talking about the heat, too, probably, because if you come up short, it's going to be awful. You're going to really feel bad. So you get a lot of weak people that are afraid of being in the presence of a genius. But I think it's what you want to do. You want to test the envelopes, as the astronauts say.
You were telling some of the students to get out and go to Manhattan, and I know you didn't mean it had to exclusively be Manhattan, but to go to Manhattan because that's where it's happening, that's where people are doing this thing.
Actually, I did.
And I thought that was interesting because I think a lot of them not being part of that kind of network probably didn't realize the importance of being on the spot. I thought you made that very important.
You know, actually, I meant exactly Manhattan. There's no question about it. It was not a metaphor. If you're going to write books in America today, you're going to do Manhattan because that's where the magazines are, that's where the publishing houses are, and there's just no way around that. You can also, and I did point out, you can also do Paris. Paris is still quite an intellectual center, and a Parisian experience will be good for the community of ideas that are available to you. But in terms of being a published American writer, it is Manhattan. And it will not change probably in the next 10 years. There are some shifts, but they're not significant shifts. You can't even do Boston. You can live in Boston, but that's only because you can take a train and go down to Manhattan. If you're going to be a published writer, at some point in that career, you're going to do Manhattan.
I thought that was an important point. I thought that was something you probably needed to hear.
Oh,
you,
sure.
You can't just mail in a manuscript.
No, you can't. I mean, and you can get lucky. We've had unusual, especially in the novel, we've had unusual books to come, what we call across the transom. We've had A Woman of Independent Means. We've had Ordinary People. The Clan of the Cave Bear, for that matter. We were talking about books that were non-agent books and non-sought. The publisher was not looking for them. People mailed them in. And we've had great successes when we look at those 3 or 4 books. But when we look at careers, and when we look at even those people, they've still got to relate to Manhattan.
And then once you make it, you can have some
Go
choice.
where you want to go.
Your base is
I live in Cincinnati. Certainly, you go where you want to
You
go.
like that?
Yeah, I do. It's my parents' home, and I'm living with my mom. My father died a couple of years ago. I like Cincinnati because we're one, a good sports town, and 2, we have great restaurants. So everything that I want is is available, and plus we have 5 non-stops every day to Manhattan. And so if I have to go up, if I have a problem with my publisher, I can go. Or any place else. We have a Delta hub, and so we can get out. I can go any place in the world because I can leave Cincinnati at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I can make the connection to Frankfurt, Germany. You can go any place, and I would not be happy if I were living in, say, Springfield, Illinois.
I want to have the listeners hear a little bit of your poetry. What are some of the themes that you're dealing with mainly now? You're certainly doing a lot with women's issues and women, well, not issues exactly.
No, I wouldn't say that. I've done a lot with individuals, and I think that's probably the only fair categorization. As you probably notice, I've been here 3 days and I've talked a lot. I really do everything I can to avoid labels. Definitions I can handle, but labels I really don't like.
I noticed that.
And I just think that it doesn't work because I don't want somebody to pick up the book and say, well, goodness, I thought she did women's themes. I don't. I do individuals. I do individual women who are interesting to me, whether it would be Billie Jean King or Phyllis Wheatley, and I've done both, or Rosa Parks. You do people that you think have made a difference, that you want to say, I think, well done. And especially in the case of like a Billie Jean King, because I'm a tennis fan, and I really, really like the stance that she's taken, and I think that she's quite an image. For Phyllis Wheatley, it would be different because Phyllis is dead, so she doesn't know I've written a poem. I don't know if Billie Jean knows either. But I wanted to do a poem for Phyllis Wheatley because she's our mother. She was the first poet that published in the United States, and I think that she did some really credible poetry. And I really don't like the way that she has been criticized. You know, people don't like her poem for George Washington or something. I think if I lived during the Revolutionary Age, I probably would have admired Washington. Here was a man fighting for individual rights. He was fighting for a new system. Why wouldn't you admire that? And, you know, and it kind of makes you angry that people are so insensitive to the reality of the situation. But then I'm a history major, and I'm always encouraging people.
That's in your favor.
I certainly think so. I'm always encouraging people to find out something about the times. People want to judge situations based on what they know in 1986. It's crazy because, one, they don't know anything about 1986, let alone what preceded. You need some perspective on time.
My background's history, so I'm a little prejudiced. But I do think of all of the disciplines, I think the one that perhaps gets you in fewer boxes and lets you be inconsistent, if that's the word, is history. You don't try to conform as much to a single theory if you look at that variety of history. And I did notice what in you over these few days what some people might call inconsistencies, but I think they're your refusal to be labeled or to just go into
Emerson teaches us, and of course kids don't read Emerson anymore, but Emerson teaches us consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. I think I read Emerson when I was about 7th, 8th grade. It's something that stuck with me. And I'm glad that it did, because who wants to be consistent?
Absolutely. That's one of the things I like to talk about with students. If you think A and you also think B, and people may think they're inconsistent, so what? You don't have to be.
It's human. I mean, you're supposed to see contradictions in your own thinking. I always feel sorry for writers that read their own work. I read some of my poetry some of my time. No, you can't go back and keep reading your books. And if you do, you'll never produce beyond that book, because you're so intimidated by what you have said, and you spend so much time trying to make sure you're not contradicting a past statement, that you end up being able to create nothing. I mean, you become Norman Mailer. Perfect example of what you wouldn't want.
I like that poem on Hands that you did the other day, though that was one of the longer ones, as I recall. But maybe there are some shorter ones that we could hear, so that we could give some examples.
Well, I certainly wanted to read one particular poem that my mother always tells me nobody understands, but it's a poem called I Am She. I happen to like it a lot because it's an abstract poem, and it's definitional. It's kind of personal to me, and it means a lot to me, so I'd like to... it also has the advantage of being short.
Okay.
Okay.
Please.
I am she, making rainbows in coffee cups, watching fish jump after midnight in my dreams. On the stove, left front burner, is the stew already chewed, certain to burn as I dream of waves of nothingness. floating to shore, riding a low moon on a slow cloud, I am she who writes the poems.
Yes, I like that one too.
I like that.
Was that the one, there was one poem I remember, was that it that you said you wanted them to like? You said,
Oh yeah, that's definitely it.
You said, I don't care if you like the other ones, but I want you to like that one.
Well, I was always taught that if you want people to do something, you must ask them.
Yeah.
And of course they have a right to refuse because it was a request. On the other hand, we find that most people, if you ask them, will do what you have asked them to do. It's so basic, and you see people get themselves into such a dither when all they had to do in the first place was sit down and say, well, this is what I'd like and this is why I'd like it. People make a mess of life for no particular reason.
You had your audience with you, certainly. They were caught up, certainly, in what you were saying. Do you enjoy teaching?
I teach at a small college in Cincinnati called the College of Mount St. Joseph. I do. I think I would miss something. Somebody asked me, how did you get your job at Mount St. Joe? I said, I begged Sister Jean for it. It's a small Catholic school, and we have a marvelous, really, outreach program. I'm a big believer in the community college movement. We are not a community college. We are a traditional four-year college, but we have a real thrust in the outreach program. When you start to look at our 17, 18, 19-year-old females, for example, we are the Women's Coeducational College, which is what we have about 20 guys on campus. But when you start to look at that young 18 to 25-year-old female who might be a mother, for example, we know that if we're not able to get her involved in an educational system, you know, we're assuming, of course, high school graduate, because we can't do anything up until that point. But if we can't get her involved in some level of educational institution, this woman will never be able to really protect and defend herself financially. She will be limited, and her child, or in many cases her children, will be limited. As a matter of fact, if we can put them in college, we can cut down on some of the, if not all of the youngsters. We end up with many young people who have one child, and we can get them in college, and we can get a degree for them as opposed to 3 or 4. Then you're really in a bind. We also reach out to the older female, because so many, but I'm saying older, I had a student who was in her 60s. We have so many older people who have time on their hands, who have something to contribute, and no particular place to contribute it. So we like to feel at Mount St. Joe that we're there. Come and take a class with us. You're up in the morning, what are you doing? Have coffee with me. Because writing, I teach a creative writing class, and we feel that all, and I should stress this for any of us who are into creative writing, all writing is creative. Many Americans, and this is not a put down of us, many Americans can't write a letter. Dear Sue, today I baked cookies. I mean, you can't get a decent letter from them. And one of the reasons they avoid writing letters is that they write poorly. So when you come to Writing 670, which is my course, what I'm saying is anything you're writing is fair game. We will criticize a letter, a memo, a newspaper article, because I get some of the journalism kids. We will also allow you to work on a creative piece, whether you're doing poetry or prose. This is not a poetry class, you know, per se. We are there to teach you.
Well, the approach to writing, it just struck me while you were saying that. You were talking, I guess it was Tuesday, on the approach to life. You start dying, you said that's something we start doing the moment we're born.
Oh, certainly.
And we're not going to escape that. And we're probably not going to change the world. But you talked about doing a little something.
It's called your life. You're talking about living your life between your birth and your death.
Well, isn't it a little bit like
life.
the writing? I mean, do a little something.
You should
Maybe
be able
you don't
to
start
communicate
off
well.
being what you want to be, but you...
But most of us, if you think about it now, I don't know about our Corning students. We had some who were going to be writers. Most of us are not going to want to either write a novel or a play or anything else. Most of us will need to communicate. One of the things that American business has discovered is that they can't read a memo from a middle level management. The people below him don't know what what they're expected to do, and the people above him don't know what he asked. He needs a creative writing course, because what we're talking about is clarity.
And they're going to be limited. Even if they can get that first job, they're not going to move up if they can't.
I'm talking about even right now, people like me should be at General Motors, because it's a big crisis that's going on, as you're well aware. I'm talking in the auto industry, but not restricted. We should be there, somebody should be there teaching middle level management how to communicate. And one of the ways that you communicate is through metaphor. People are so afraid of metaphor.
That's what makes the idea jump out.
It's what makes me, oh, that's what you mean. And if you can find the proper metaphor to carry the weight of the idea, you will communicate better. But a lot of people are simply missing that. Why are they missing that? Because they haven't done their reading. So the first thing you're saying when you're teaching people how to write is, what are you reading?
That's why poetry, I think, would be a good exercise for the person who doesn't expect to be a quote poet, but the use of words intensively and properly and appropriately.
If I had my choice, the first thing I'd teach them how to write is a letter to their friend. If I was doing an exercise, the first thing I'd say is, okay, write a letter to your best friend who moved to California last year. Much more so than any poem, because a poem is intimidating and it does require a certain form. A letter only requires information.
Better teaching tool than we.
It certainly is, because it's something everybody does.
Could you do Snowflake?
Could I do
the
what?
one on the snowflake?
Oh, sure.
I'm not sure if that was
It's
the
called
title,
Winter
but
Poem.
the
Yeah,
one
no,
on your
no problem.
brow.
Certainly. It's called Winter Poem.
Winter Poem.
No problem. Once, a snowflake fell on my brow, and I loved it so much, and I kissed it, and it was happy, and called its cousins and brothers, and a web of snow engulfed me then. I reached to love them all, and I squeezed them, and they became a spring rain, and I stood perfectly still and was a flower.
Ah, I like that.
Yeah, that's a fun poem. It's a nice poem. But you know, I used to be a part of Reading is Fundamental when I lived in Manhattan, and I consider that very important. And one of the things we stressed at the RIF program is that, of course, the first book you give a non-reader should either be a mystery or a Western because of the action. You can give almost any non-reader an action book, and he'll be able to read it. But if you give him a mystery, which is my personal preference, if you put a mystery in his hand, he has to do either inductive or deductive reasoning all the way through it. So if you give him 10 Little Indians, right, or any Agatha Christie, because they work so well, any Agatha Christie, you've got somebody thinking. So you've got them involved in a book on a certain level, analyzing motives, trying to figure out, could this person have done it or not? You'll teach him how to read in about half the time, as if you gave him, and I say this not to the detriment, but if you gave him Shakespeare, or if you gave him Don Quixote or something.
To start.
It's not a good place to start. The best place to start for the American illiterate, I mean, I'm sure you're aware of this, is either in detective or Western. Western because you've got the level of action. And it's a marvelous tool, and what all that any of it means is that we have got to communicate, which is what I wanted to just be sure that we're stressing here. For any of us who would be interested in writing, the essence of writing is communication.
Thank you very much for communicating with us and telling us at least a little, giving some idea about what writing and creative writing is all about. My guest has been Nikki Giovanni, who's been visiting scholar at the college this week. And thanks again for being on the program, for being at the college. We've enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you all for looking in. This is Walter Smith speaking for the Learning Resources Center here at Corning College. Thank you all for looking in.